Hi, I'm Allie, a test prep tutor and strategist at Geek. Today we're going to cover everything you need to know about the SAT reading section. The SAT reading section is 65 minutes in length, and it includes 5 passages with 52 total questions. The reading section accounts for 400 points of your overall score. Now, this 400 points is half of your reading and writing section score and a quarter of your overall SAT score. There are 3 question types that you'll see on the SAT reading section. The first question type is how the author uses evidence. These are what I'd call the most straightforward questions on the SAT reading. These may ask you to identify evidence within a passage that supports an argument, an answer to a previous question, or connect a graphic with the passage. The main objective of these types of questions is to find and use evidence directly from the given passage. You won't have to infer much here, you'll simply have to read and find what the question is looking for. So these are the style of questions where you're going to want to go right back to the passage and find your answer. You're not going to do a lot of thinking here or inferring. You're really going to want to rely on exactly what the passage says. Now, the second type of question is understanding words in context. These questions get a bit more complicated and require you to use vocabulary knowledge to understand what a word in the passage probably means. You'll have to use context clues from the passage to help you determine what a certain word most likely means. Another variation of this type of question is to determine how the author's word choice contributes to the meaning, style, and tone of the passage. So these ones, you're less likely to be able to just go straight to the passage and find your answer. These ones are going to require you to use some critical thinking skills and evaluate how words are being used in the context of the passage. The third type of question that you'll see on the SAT reading section is analysis in history and social studies and in science. So unlike the ACT, the SAT doesn't have a specific section to test science skills, so they rely on the reading section to see how you interpret given data and examine hypotheses. You'll also have to think deeper on these types of questions to make inferences and interpret data past the limitations of what's black and white within the passage. The good news is that you won't have to bring any specific scientific knowledge to the SAT. Everything you need will be able to be derived from the passage and the graphs that are provided. Overall, the SAT reading section is attempting to test the following skills: reading comprehension, vocab and context, command of evidence, scientific reasoning, and logical arguments. So every single question that you see on the SAT reading section will come back to one or more of these skills that they're testing. Now let's talk a bit more about the passages on the SAT reading section. Now you'll recall that there are 5 total passages. 4 of these passages will be standalone, as in you'll have one passage and then corresponding questions that go along with that passage. The last passage will actually be a tandem passage, so it's 2 passages in one, 2 shorter passages that count as one passage, and this will often include questions that ask you to relate between the 2 passages, compare and contrast between the 2 passages, that sort of thing. Every passage will be between 500 and 750 words, so they're relatively short. They're all going to be around the same length, and they're each going to have a set of questions that correspond with that passage. Now let's go through the types of passages that you might see on the SAT reading section. The first is scientific works. This could be a published scientific journal that examines basic concepts or developments in the sciences. It could be a piece on something like global warming, maybe how video games affect your reflexes, or why gravity is a thing. You get the idea. It's all to do with science in some way or another. You're probably going to have a lot of terms you've never seen before, scientific language, that sort of thing. They're not testing your understanding of science, but they are testing your ability to reason through and interpret scientific passages. The second type of passage is fictional literary passages. So this one's probably pretty self-explanatory. This is fiction, right? So you're going to see a short story or an excerpt from a longer literary piece. And you're going to be responsible for understanding things like the main idea, why the author chose the tone that they chose or the words that they did, basic happenings in the story, that kind of thing. This is something that you've probably seen and worked with for a lot of your life in school. From even really early on, you start reading fictional passages and interpreting the author's main points and things like that. So this one may feel a little bit more comfortable to you. The third type of passage is government documents. And this is where you'll often see that dual passage or tandem passage show up. It's usually something to do with US history, but not always. It could be something to do with human rights issues. It could be a famous speech or a famous essay, something that someone historically has written. You can expect a lot of flowery language, legal language, or official documents. These can often be some of the hardest passages for students just because it's language that we're unfamiliar with. So it's really important to practice reading this type of document so that you feel a little bit more comfortable on test day. The last type of passage is social sciences. So this could be social sciences in the areas of sociology, economics, psychology, something like that. This is often where you'll find charts and graphs to support the work in the passage. It could be a research document with supporting evidence in graph form, where you're going to be asked to kind of interpret information or understand the relationship between the text and the graphs. So oftentimes, this is where you're starting to look at data and things like that, but not always. All right, so we've gone over all the basics of the SAT reading section, what you can expect on test day. The next question you're probably thinking is, okay, great, now how do I actually score well on the SAT reading section, or how do I improve my score? I'm going to be frank with you. I think this is the hardest section on the SAT to improve your score on. It can really be tough, especially if you have a time crunch. If you're in a time crunch, memorize those math concepts, work through some of those grammar topics on the writing section. Those are easy wins for you. Whereas on the reading section, this can honestly just take a lot of time to really see a score improvement. At the end of the day, the SAT is testing your reading comprehension skills. And this is something that theoretically you've been working on basically since you entered the school system in kindergarten. But it's something that doesn't improve in a short period of time. A few things that you can do if you're really looking to improve your SAT reading section score. The first is don't be afraid to skim passages. So you may be told in school you want to just look line by line at every single thing when you're reading a passage. Don't skip words. Don't read the Spark Notes. Read the actual book. But on the SAT reading section, honestly, skimming passages can be an asset for you, especially depending on how much of a time crunch you're in on test day. So don't be afraid to do that. You can always go back to the passage, especially some of those questions that really rely on specific details of the passage. Skimming it is not a bad idea at all. So kind of just see what works best for you, but that's just one piece of advice. The second is consider reading the questions before the passage. So for some people, reading the questions first can be helpful. This can allow your brain to start triggering on this information that is going to be asked of you while you're reading the passage. This can also just be a personal thing too, but it's worth trying if you're really trying to increase your score on this section. The third tip I have is time yourself so you know what your weaknesses are. This is so critical. Before you do anything, take a full SAT reading section, timed, and see where you end. See how many questions you have left. And we can be a resource too. You can always give us a call if you need some personal advice. But this can really be an indicator of what kind of strategy you need to be taking on the SAT reading section. If you're really, really crunched for time, your strategy is going to look a lot different than someone who can just naturally read a lot faster and is naturally a bit more comfortable on the questions. Those strategies are going to look really, really different. So make sure you understand where your weaknesses are, understand what your strategy should look like. The fourth is obvious, but it's going to be practice. Once you understand what your strategies need to be, you really just need to get in the habit of practicing on these sections. A lot of people will tell you just, go read some books. But if you're in a time crunch, you really need to be focusing on the passages that have been tested on the SAT before. Go back, download some practice tests, and just work through as many as you possibly can. This is going to help your brain to start processing information more quickly, understanding what patterns show up on the SAT reading section, that kind of thing. So practice, practice, practice. The last tip I have is review our reading blogs on our website. We have a lot of tips. We have some more detailed descriptions of the types of questions and strategies to take. So take a look at those. And as you kind of dive a little bit more deeper into your strategy and preparation, those may be helpful for you. So I hope this video has been helpful as you start to prepare for the SAT reading section. Thank you so much for joining me. If you'd like to see more content like this, make sure you subscribe to our channel, and you can also find us at testgeek.com/blog.